this session kind of interesting and entertaining for you if I possibly can. The topic kind of leads nicely on from what Swati was just talking about, which is the topic I'm going to talk about is invisible AI. So invisible AI talk about three things: the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I think as I go through things, you'll see that it and intentionally into the session that we just had. So just to set some context, we live in kind of very strange times at the moment with the pandemic. But even before the pandemic, we were living in this period of technological hyper-acceleration where technology just seems to be kind of getting faster and faster. And with the pandemic, we've kind of seen kind of years worth of transformation and technological transformation happening in a matter of months. Hopefully for the benefit in terms of things like the kind of drugs and vaccines that are being put together. But it does feel like technology is kind of heading towards us at a blur at the moment. So exponential technology is already challenging, and it was already challenging prior to the pandemic. And it challenges our linear thinking, because as we're thinking step by step, technology is going ahead in leaps and bounds. And one of the things that we need to be kind of aware of is that that technology sometimes can get ahead of legislation or governance or kind of the guardrails that we need to kind of put into place. But what is invisible AI? Back to the topic that we're here to talk about. So I think the best explanation that I've got from you is from kind of Obi-Wan Kenobi from Star Wars, and his comment on invisible AI is that it's an energy field created by all living things around us, penetrates us, and binding the galaxy together. So Swati talked about some of the examples of Netflix and Amazon kind of previously. And we log on to our smartphones now using our face, and the technology that does that is an invisible AI. But it is literally built into kind of all the applications that we're using, whether we know it or not. I'm presenting to you now through PowerPoint, and in PowerPoint there's some kind of AI that allows me to translate the words that are on the screen into another language, and so I can translate quite easily that into Mandarin Chinese in this example through built-in or invisible AI. Just to kind of double check that it's kind of doing what we think it's doing, I've used Google Translate here to take my PowerPoint translation and convert it back into kind of English, and you can see that it's a fairly good representation of what I put in there. So not just PowerPoint, all of the Microsoft products, all of the Google suite of applications all have artificial intelligence, and in many other places all built into them. So let's look at some of the examples of good invisible AI, and so where it's kind of helpful. So back in the days when I used to do presentations and I would be stood in front of you and able to see your faces, I would take a picture of the audience and I would use a website where I could upload that picture, and it would analyze the faces and it would tell me how happy people were. And in this example from a presentation that I did a little while back, it's analysed all the images, and actually the chap on the poster in the background is actually the happiest of all of these. I like to think that this because I wasn't actually presenting at the time, but maybe as you went down when I started presenting, I don't know. But just an example of invisible AI, a web service where you can upload a picture and it does its magic and produces a result. Another example for you is one that I like, which is around black and white photography, vintage photography. I love black and white photos, and there's many tools now out there on the internet that use this invisible AI technology to convert them into color. And in this particular instance, it's not only colorized the picture, but actually increased the definition of the picture as well. So it's taken quite a pixelated picture, as we saw before, and kind of turned it into a much more high definition picture. Another example, my partner is very keen on tennis, tennis player and watcher of tennis. And Stanford University did some work where they took all of the great tennis professionals and analyzed all of their video footage, and they used an AI to simulate what it would be like if different players played different players. And in this image, we've got Federer playing himself, and he's playing the shots that he would normally play if he was playing an opponent, and returning them in a way that he would return if he was playing another opponent. And presumably this game would go on and on for ad infinitum, because he would maybe never beat himself, I don't know. So another example of good AI. Similar piece of invisible AI that Stanford created is they took 10 years worth of cable TV news and fed it into an AI system for it to analyze the images and text and probably bore itself to death on, and came up with this system that you can go onto the internet now and use, and from it you can analyze that footage. And in this particular example, we've asked it to count the screen time of how often Joe Biden's been on cable news as opposed to Donald Trump, and you can see the analysis here running across the screen over a period of time, and you can see over the last couple of weeks the kind of peaks and troughs as the presidential race kind of played itself out. But in addition to that, it can do things like say across the news networks, what's the diversity in the presenters that are presenting the news. So you can do some quite interesting analysis on this as well as on the actual topic of the news. So there are a few examples of kind of good AI, invisible AI. So things that we may not see as AI hidden from us, but producing kind of pleasurable or pleasing results. So if that was good, what about the bad? So probably the first one, and the pandemic again has accelerated the use of automation and artificial intelligence powered automation. As kind of people have been furloughed to continue to do some of the jobs. So automation in this context is if I can type it on a keyboard, then I can automate the task. I can add some artificial intelligence into that, and I can kind of create an automated 24/7 version of a task that a person might do. And that leads us on to kind of everybody's thoughts about what artificial intelligence is going to do. And that is it's going to take over and fire us. There's pretty good analysis from from very good sources that says that artificial intelligence is going to literally change every person's job, kind of as we know it over a period of time. Some jobs may go. Lots of jobs will also be created. There's probably going to be a kind of net neutral effect of that. But the one certainty is that AI will impact all of our jobs, if not now, into the future. So going back to that picture that I showed you before, and I said it took what was an old black and white pixelated picture and turned it into a color one. So this pixelization technique of taking poor quality images was applied this year to not great results. So you may have seen this. It's a pixelated picture of President Obama on the left there, and using an AI system which creates high definition pictures from pixelated pictures. It actually created a face in high resolution of a white person. So this is an example of bias that Swati was talking about before in that algorithm, that actually the training set that was used was predominantly white male faces. And so therefore we give it a pixelated picture, and its presumption is that that's what we're looking for as an end result and is an unintended consequence. So another example is I talked about the translation before that was built into kind of Microsoft PowerPoint. And I showed you how that was a kind of good and representative translation. But Catalyst have done some work, the Catalyst organization, that said that actually some of these language translations are actually reinforcing gender stereotypes. So if I look at an example in English of something like "he cares for the family," if we translate that into another language, some of the language translation tools will translate that into "she cares for the family." And it is enforcing gender stereotypes. So just because we have an invisible AI solution that will translate from one language to another doesn't necessarily mean that we should 100% trust the results that come back out of the other side. Another example from this year, and this kind of almost beggars belief really that this took place, but there was a company called Genderify, and they spun up a website using some invisible AI. You could give it a person's name and it would tell you whether it was a man or a woman. Immediately flawed from the world we live in today, in that that's a binary stereotype, as in man or woman, and we don't live in a binary world anymore. We're all much more nuanced than that. But also what it did is it would correctly identify that Megan Smith was a woman, but add doctor in front of it, and it would say that she was actually a man. That service got taken away very, very quickly. It was within hours of it being stood up. And not saying it's an intentional bias, but a bias that was built into that system, and a bad use of invisible AI. So if that was bad, let's look at some of the kind of ugly versions. And probably the worst one over the kind of previous months has been the A-level result, where they were estimated initially by teachers, and then for whatever reason, the government decided that they would give them to an algorithm to predict the results. And again, based on your kind of postcode, the type of school that you work in, and what its history is, those results were skewed, and it discriminated against people that were living in less well-off areas, and schools that were kind of less performing, and led to the kind of protests that we saw here. And that definitely is a kind of use of ugly AI, invisible AI. So there's also a website that can tell you how normal you are, and you can see from the headline at the bottom that apparently I'm pretty strange. But this website actually will go through, and it will use image recognition to tell you kind of how old you are. It will tell you how good looking you are, and you can see that unfortunately on the kind of scale of the average, I'm kind of less than good looking. But it also, fortunately tells me that I'm a bit younger than I am. Again, uses a very kind of binary stereotype in terms of am I a man or a woman. It looks at my body mass index from analysing my face and tells me whether I'm overweight or not. And it gives me a life expectancy, which, to be honest, I'm not that happy about. So this is you could consider this as very ugly AI, but actually there's a point behind this. And this was a website which is called hownormalami.eu. And the point behind this is to educate people into how some of these solutions are being used. So you can go onto this website and you can go through and see kind of how beautiful you are, and whether it gets your age or not right. And it gives you some really interesting and very balanced views on artificial intelligence and invisible AI. Unfortunately, that same technology gets used by other people. So the British police have had a couple of attempts at this. One that folded quite quickly, that they were using to use facial recognition to analyze faces to see whether people were criminals or not. I mean, it was wholly inaccurate and got pulled very quickly. Earlier on this year, they thought they'd have another go with a facial recognition system to detect people's mood, presumably to look at crowd control and things like that to see whether people were getting angry. But again, was pulled quite quickly when they realized that not only was it not accurate, but they couldn't defend the results that came out of it. So another version of ugly AI. And there are versions of this all over the place. So again, Swati talked before about the kind of justice system and how algorithms are being used to decide whether people, whether their cases go to court or not, but also, whether they're given probation. We're increasingly, if we're going for job interviews, having facial recognition and video facial recognition decide whether we're going to get through to the next stage of a job or not. Even used in Tinder. So that same thing that kind of said whether I was kind of good looking or not is used to kind of balance who you get to see in Tinder based on whether you're within the tolerance of similar looking people to you. Car insurance, there was a little while ago now, there was a car insurance company that decided to say if you like them on Facebook, they would offer you a discount on your car insurance, but they actually trawled through your Facebook profile to see kind of the type of posts that you put, and then they analysed your risk based on that without telling you that they were doing it, and without that would affect your insurance. And then people are either getting loans or not getting loans, again, based on kind of algorithms, depending on their kind of gender and kind of where they live in the country. So a whole bunch of examples of what is ugly AI. So hopefully that makes something that perhaps to a lot of people is invisible, makes it visible to you. It's not that the technology itself is either good or evil. So AI in itself is not good or evil. It merely is a reflection of ourselves. So we say that AI is like a mirror, and what we see is ourselves reflected back, which is very true. The kind of challenge that we have is that that same mirror kind of amplifies. So, you can see the kind of multiple images in here. So what we'd like to think of is, just ourselves reflected back by AI can be amplified beyond all control. Some of the professors at Stanford University that were kind of making those systems that I showed you some examples of before said that any conclusions that you take from invisible AI, as I'll call it, need to be inspected very carefully to determine whether bias is playing a factor in the results. And quite often they are, because of the lack of diversity in the teams that Swati talked about before that are creating these applications. And they actually said that when we stop looking to see whether those systems are biased. And we completely rely on either the data or rely on the artificial intelligence itself to build the systems, then that's when stuff starts to go wrong. Deliberately, a picture of here, I'm a big fan on Twitter of Not My Robots, and this is one of the robots that kind of makes me go cold every time I see it. It's a kind of white, sterile, male-looking image. If that's the kind of future of robotics for us, then that's not one that I really want to play part of. So it leads us to kind of where we need to be. And we need to have responsible and explainable AI, and it needs to reflect the diversity and the nuances of us as individuals. I gave you some kind of examples before, but it needs to be fair, it needs to be trustworthy, it needs to be safe, it needs to respect our privacy, and it needs to be transparent. And as Swathi said before, it needs to be explainable. So when it comes up with a result of, that it comes up with, we need to be able to say how it came up with that result, what information it used, what training data it used to kind of make that result, and see whether it's one that we feel is a kind of fair and equitable one for all of us. So we live in an increasingly digital world, but this is a quote that I love from Neil Turok. He said, "We are analog beings," and some of the things again that I wrote down that Swazi was talking about, compassion and empathy and creativity and passion, all of those things that kind of make us very analog beings, and the kind of creativity especially. But we're increasingly living in a digital world, and we don't want to make ourselves into digital beings. It might feel like sometimes that's the way we're heading, but we need to be a merger of our analog selves and all of this creativity that is really working augmented by the technology that we live in. He finally says that we're facing a quantum future. And we think technology is moving fast. We're facing quantum technology at some point in the not too distant future, but that's a topic for another conversation. So I'd like to kind of leave you with some details of where you can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn. If anything I've said has resonated with you, check us out at weanai.org. We're a group of volunteers. We'd love to have people join us. Whether you believe AI is a good thing or a bad thing, it doesn't matter. We just want diversity of opinion and kind of people. But I'd ask you not to believe. This is actually a misquote from kind of Buddha, but I like the quote anyway. I'd like to not to believe anything that I said just because I've said it to you, but actually look around and see, try and make this invisible AI visible to you. And then see whether you think it is something that's a good and benefit to all of us. And if it's not, then encourage you to speak up about it. I think I'm probably over my time. Apologies for the few technical issues at the start. But I hope you enjoyed the session, and I'll hand you back now.